give us the down low on a really important topic for us marketers, which is all about how do we break down the barriers as marketers in the boardroom, and how do we become effective in leadership positions, including the CMO position across the organization, and how do we create maximum impact and influence. So without further ado, I want to introduce our two special guests for this session here. And honestly, neither need any introduction whatsoever. So first is Daushan Hamza. Daushan has had an illustrious career. He's actually on more boards than I could pretty much name. But actually what I love about his personality and his ethos is it's all around deeds over actions. And today he works with a range of different organizations, from charities right through to education establishments and right through to a range of different boards across the FTSE 100 and 250. So he pitches himself as a strategic creative consultant, a strategic advisor, and also a keynote speaker. Welcome, Daushan. It honestly is a pleasure to have you on this afternoon. And secondly, we've got Rory Sutherland, great friend, and one that I tend to have the most amazing conversations with whenever I pick up with him. And of course, he is the vice chairman of Ogilvy UK, but clearly so much more than that. So without further ado, I'm going to kick off and just pitch a question out there, guys, which is all around the CMO. And why do we actually think the CMO should be represented in the boardroom? And Daushan, I'm going to come right to you because I think you got some really cool stats on this. So let's hear from you. What's the important role of the CMO in the boardroom, and why should they be represented in the first place?
I mean, thanks, Richard. There are a couple of things there, aren't there? What happens in the boardroom, and then the value of the individuals around the table. We've got to remember, within a board, we're working within a collective. And if we go back to the core essence and the functions of the board, we often talk about, I have a simple model, call it the 3 I's. We talk about oversight, governance, strategy, finance. But what we're finding out, particularly in today's very much disruptive, volatile, uncertain world, are the other 2 I's are coming into play massively: insight and foresight. Now, when we bring those 2 I's into play, the value of having a diverse group of individuals around the table is magnified. We break out of this groupthink mentality. We move into new pastures, become more original, creative. So the value of having other sectors, particularly marketing, and I think I understand the stat you're looking for, but sectors that are underrepresented, like marketing around the board table, particularly in the UK, brings more value on the insight and the foresight piece as our organizations try to navigate in the very, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous environments that we're going through at the moment. I think the stat that brings this to life is if we look at the British organizations within the FTSE 100, the magic number is 2/3. 2/3 of our CEOs in the FTSE 100 come from a finance background. If we look at the S&P 500 in the States, 2/3 of their CEOs, and this does mirror board directors approximately as well, come from a sales and marketing background. And if we just go into continental Europe, now that Brexit has happened, and we look at the DAX, 2/3 of their CEOs come from a more technology or engineering background. And it's amazing when we look at these 3 countries, the cultures and the leadership notions. We then come back to the UK and say, one of the blind spots for our boards here is the blind spot of marketing. And I'm sure we're going to go on to what marketing is and what it means. So I think those are some of the insights, Richie, that sort of elucidate your point.
I mean, quite amazing when you think about the geographical spread of that. And in fact, Rory, coming to you, I remember a couple of months ago, you actually pinged an email around where you actually sort of illustrated this problem about how few marketers are actually able to elevate themselves up into those sort of CMO positions. Sorry, those CEO positions, should I say?
Yes.
Why do you think that's the case? And actually, why is that detrimental? No, what's the big deal, guys? Come on.
I mean, there is a huge amount of language highly specific to board governance, which marketers don't always master. I mean, for example, I think it's fair to say marketers tend to play very fast and loose with the concept of ROI and use it in a way which is unrecognizable to a finance director, for instance. There's also a secondary question, which is one, do you want marketing to be on the board? Now, that sounds like a silly question to ask. And secondly, should the CMO on the board be called a CMO? I mean, there is some trend towards chief growth officer, chief customer officer. So in other words, there's a C-suite and marketing needs to be represented there in some shape or form. But there is a question in terms of how it markets itself.
Absolutely.
And it's worth noting that marketing has done a very bad job of marketing, he said, using a very grotesque sentence, but you get what I mean, which is that it tends to be seen as marcoms. It's only one of the 5 Ps. It's become, and increasingly even more in things like B2B companies, it's become kind of reprographics with a degree. It isn't seen as a strategic discipline. It's seen as a downstream discipline, which adds some effectively some magic fairy dust to the value created in the serious part of the business. Now, I don't subscribe to that view. I'm a sort of Austrian school economist in that I believe that value is created in the head as much as it is created in the factory. And therefore, understanding what your product or service means to customers is absolutely instrumental in the value creation process. But most people, particularly from a finance background, who have what you might call the Chicago School shareholder value model of the world, see value as a byproduct of efficiency. It's based on the assumption that people already know what they want. They know exactly to the penny how much they're prepared to pay for it, and that your job is simply to deliver that at as low a cost as possible. Now, in many, many business sectors, I think that's a catastrophic approach to business, okay? But nonetheless, that is the view that probably dominates in business schools. Correct. And dominates in economics, not Austrian economics.
I've got across here, it's a status quo, isn't it? It's a status quo of what's expected given our gatekeepers and the way that we think in a very linear fashion. When I say we, gatekeepers think in a linear fashion. There's
also a really interesting question of what constitutes a high status conversation. Okay. And I always noticed when I was very rarely a non-executive director on a few organizations that 95% of the time would be spent on the balance sheet in some shape or form.
Yeah.
Jules Goddard at London Business School makes a very good point that the typical balance sheet contains about 6 cost lines and 1 revenue line, and the discussion generally proceeds in that ratio. So that inordinately more attention is paid to cost reduction than is paid to value generation or growth. And there's a question I raise as well about whether we need some sort of shadow separate entity for marketing to exert its influence, which is that if you have a setting where a financial conversation, a spreadsheet, is high status information sharing, whereas abstract nouns are low status information sharing, marketing's kind of doomed to some extent.
Yep.
And I've always noticed when I was a non-executive director, everybody would be going, well, the product's not selling very well, so we're going to reduce the price. And I'd be sitting at the end of the table, and what I wanted to say was, have you thought of making it pink? But I realized that if I made a suggestion like that, I would be effectively disregarded as a lunatic for the next 15 meetings. It was career conversational suicide to introduce what you might call an abstract marketing psychological component into a reductionist conversation. So I do wonder if there's an opportunity to create a separate space for separate discussions with the chief executive present, where, now, if you look at that German thing, okay, it reflects partly the status of different countries. If you're in California, the board will be dominated by technologists.
Yes.
In Germany, it's dominated by engineers because that's the highest status form of conversation. And in Britain, it's dominated by finance.
Finance, yeah.
Because that's a high status mode of conversation.
Agreed, and I think it comes down to many ways. I loved your pink analogy, pink versus pricing. There we go, guys. Here we go. There's an interesting point. There's an interesting point here, and it's the thought that actually, and you come back to sort of classical long and short sort of theory that outside of marketing no one's ever heard of, but the thought then being actually a brand lens put on into a pricing conversation actually makes pricing less elastic, and you can actually increase
Absolutely.
pricing ability by getting your brand play right. And actually, a lot of people don't pay much heed to that. And I imagine that if you pitch that in the boardroom, whether you would get much traction because they don't have a real understanding
I
of
mean,
how that dynamic
interestingly,
works.
a huge amount of brand value is delivered really by pricing power. Okay. The problem is it's harder to measure than, say, incremental sales.
Yeah.
Because Samsung can't really calculate what they could sell a television for that was equivalent in specifications, but branded Zog. You know, I always use Zog as this imaginary non-brand, okay, as a kind of counterfactual. Now, there's an interesting problem which I have to raise, which is marketing looked at accountability and measurement and digital as though it were their salvation, because they went, finally, we'll have data to take into the boardroom so that we can hold our own in conversations with the finance director. Now, having worked in direct marketing for 15 years, I've actually just written a piece for Impact, the MRS magazine, saying, I'm sorry, we should have warned you about this. And the warning which we didn't make, which we should have done, is that actually you look at measurement and accountability as your salvation, it turns into a curse. And the reason it turns into a curse is, yes, you can justify some parts of what you do. The problem is that once you start presenting measurable activities, you're no longer allowed to do anything else. And my argument is that effective marketing by necessity, particularly effective long-term, Binet and field marketing, is of necessity something that you can't quantify. Yes. Or rather, not quite quantify, but you can't attribute the value to any particular individual activity.
That's interesting.
And so as a result, we focus on the short term because the short term allows us to justify our existence, when the long term may actually be more valuable. It's simply less quantifiable and less attributable.
So this is where marketers can realize their magic. If you go back to a couple of those earlier points, and I've had the quote thrown at me here in the UK, marketing, what color are the crayons? So we are talking about that executional element, that communications element, as opposed to the strategic element. And I use the word magic a lot. I'm going to say it again, the magical element that marketing can bring to an exco or a boardroom. When we try and define marketing, my view is very firmly, and it does come from a P&G lens, slightly biased here, that marketing is the growth engine or the spark plugs of an organization. When we build a narrative around that, we can resonate more within an executive committee, an exco, or within the boardroom, because we're building a narrative for growth. If ever you need a narrative for growth, we've seen it over the last 2 years, where our previous models of data, analysis, and prediction have been shot to pieces. And we couldn't have seen it coming, but we have a narrative we can build.
And you're talking about certainly a changing landscape, skill set, capabilities, and techniques that are going to work. So in this instance, I mean, I would hazard a guess that the average age of our typical CMOs are sort of going into sort of upper echelon, shall we say? And do we really feel that they're prepared for the future? And what would you say are some of the skill sets that CMOs that sit in that board level do really need to have in order to be effective?
We come back to this concept of seeing the future or laying out a foundation for growth. We look at the field that's been dominated by those that work in strategy. And if we look at marketing, and we have a leading agency practitioner here in Rory. But how are agencies perceived amongst those of us who are gatekeepers, who sit on executive committees, who are on boards? Are they perceived as a professional service firm, be it your top tier strategy firms, the audit firms that do provide management consultancy, or again, are they seen as what color are the crayons? There's some brand work. We don't fully understand brand, but when you bring your brand definition from like a P&G to play, i.e. a promise delivered, you build that promise, that narrative across an organization, and then you're working to operationalize it, whether it's now or in the future. So Richie, to the point in terms of what skills, I still say, we are champions of the end user, whether that's a customer, a consumer, a citizen in public service, or a beneficiary in civil society and other organizations. but the lens of growth is a magic we bring. And that's how we can reverse that conversation that Rory referenced from, I think, Jules Goddard at LBS, from the fact that we focus disproportionately on the cost drivers, as opposed to those areas of opportunity and magical transformation, that top line growth, and that transformative growth. And
Well,
marketeers can play in there.
There are several asymmetries at work here. One of them is what I call the famous Canadian problem, which is there aren't many famous Canadians because there are, but everybody assumes they're American. Okay. My cousin Kiefer, for example. Okay. Once you become famous as a Canadian, everybody assumes you're a Yank. Okay. Now, actually, if you're an organization that does great marketing, most of the credit goes to the product. Okay. Really successful marketing does not obtain the reaction, that is great marketing. It obtains the reaction, what a fantastic product or service. And so the credit will never quite go to marketing adequately in the same way that it never goes to Canada adequately, or Belgium, because, you know, if you're a famous Belgian, everybody assumes you're French. Okay.
But Rory, you're just suggesting there that marketing then again is through that comms lens, because clearly that then
No. If you get everything right, your positioning, your price, everything right, okay, the reaction is not they marketed that really well. The reaction is from the consumer as well as the business, we did a great job here.
Got it.
And marketing to some extent works at the level of the unconscious. And so as a result, it never gets its due credit. The other problem is that marketing works in the area of opportunity, and it's always much easier to quantify a reduced cost than a lost opportunity. So I occasionally argue that procurement and finance are both disciplines that in a sense, profit unfairly from an asymmetry, which is it's much, much easier to get the credit for a reduced cost than to take you're much more likely to take the credit for a reduced cost than you are to take the blame for a missed opportunity caused by that cost cutting. And I think marketing, it's worth remembering that a large number of business decisions, if you're talking about logistics, you know what success looks like in advance. Now, to a degree in marketing, it has to be exploratory and experimental. And so, the answers cannot be definitive in the same way. And actually, one of the arguments I make is that, first of all, don't just define the success and value of marketing by the extent to which it obtains objectives that you've defined in advance. Because if you do that, you're undervaluing it, because marketing, particularly mass marketing, probably has a whole bunch of other benefits, which are impossible to quantify or even to actually see. I mean, just generalize fame, okay? If you're famous, people will work for you for less money, okay? People will come to you with good ideas. When your chief executive rings somebody up, they return the call, okay? All of those things are benefits of being famous. They're all kind of probabilistic, all right? But they're impossible to attribute to any particular piece of activity or any particular decision. And so, fame works really by exposing your surface area to upside opportunity in ways that you can't necessarily define in advance. Because people have heard of you, weird shit happens that wouldn't have happened. I mean, I noticed this extraordinarily when I launched my book, okay, which is The Weird Effects of Fame and Scale. It was a kind of Byron Sharp lesson, which was, I saw my book as a book about behavioral science of interest to marketers, some business people, generally as a kind of specialist tome. And then purely by accident, I appeared on the Chris Evans breakfast show on Virgin Radio. And Chris read the book and liked it. I didn't know this. I was in Cannes and I was totally unaware of this. But the following day was just quoting the book extensively on the program. And for about 10 days, I was out selling J.K. Rowling and the Highway Code. Okay, on Amazon. And what you realize, of course, there are whole markets there. Even in B2B, where B2B likes to think, no, we know who our customers are. Well, kind of, but you don't know who they're going to be in 3 years' time, by the way. Okay. But actually, there are whole markets out there which you will absolutely unwittingly turn your back on if you pursue efficiency as a pure goal.
Yep.
And I think it comes down to this thing, which is every business needs to understand this thing, which comes up in algorithms in computing quite a lot, and also comes up in animal foraging, such as bees, which is the explore-exploit trade-off. that there's a correct ratio of exploiting what you know and exploring what you don't. By the way, if you've just had a major change like COVID, the ratio should probably shift a little bit in the direction of explore, because the past is now a less reliable guide to the future.
So hence the skills that we need as marketeers are to be more adaptable, but really this aspect of being creative and a culture of being able to take risks, which is easier to be done in the States, as we've said, given the makeup of personnel there, versus here in the UK. The point I think Rory's making as well is sometimes as marketeers, yes, we need to be a bit more commercial. We keep saying that, but also we need to be a bit more confident. And the cliche we've coined is that not everything that matters can be measured, and not everything that we measure matters.
Yes.
And if marketeers can gravitate towards that which matters more and resonate strategically, we have a bigger canvas we can paint on, richer stories to tell. And it just moves us into that sphere. I know, Rory, we talk about this of having interesting conversations, but the conversations that resonate and the conversations that can lead to growth and move us away from that just purely comms picture that many gatekeepers have of us.
I think, Darshan, the ultimate problem is, and I wonder, so, Rory, you talk about opportunity of fame, right? My God, if you said that to your CEO, what would they say, right? Justify it for me. Well, give me the benchmark. You kidding me? I can't spend £1 million if all of a sudden I'm trying to figure out that, I don't know, see what happens.
Well, this is why I wonder whether the correct place to have these high-level marketing conversations is in a board meeting. Exactly. Because there should be other interdisciplinary meetings with the chief executive present, which might present kind of shadow meetings, which might present a better opportunity. Because one of the things that concerns me is that in any conversation which involves a mix of quantitative and qualitative metrics, the quantitative drives out the qualitative, which is exactly what Daushan was just saying.
Yes.
That, we tend to think that think something matters because it's measurable rather than measuring what matters. And there's a wonderful YouTube conversation between Mark Carney and Damien Hirst. And they're talking about currency. It's very easy to find on Google because Mark Carney and Damien Hirst don't normally appear on the same stage. And Damien Hirst asks a really interesting question of Mark Carney. He says, what I don't understand, he says, is that when I paint a painting, it's purely qualitative, okay? Everybody knows that the canvas and the paint and the wood and the raw materials have cost a few $100, but they'll pay anything for a painting, $500, $5,000, $5 million, no problem, okay? So the second I make a skull that contains platinum and diamonds, the first question is, how much do you pay for the diamonds? How much do you pay for the platinum? Because I need to know the intrinsic value in order to somehow appraise this.
Yes. And
so you have this interesting thing that when you have a kind of mix of what you might call quantifiable and unquantifiable value, the quantifiable dominates the conversation, which is really, really interesting.
I think so. And I want to move it on a little bit into talk about pathways here, because what I'm noticing, by the way, and I'm no CMO, nor am I a CEO of a big organization, but what I'm certainly noticing when I think about pathway potential of people who have gone to kind of almost try to get into the CEO position, they have to go through commercial. And it almost feels like you got a CMO who has to almost go in to prove his worth in a commercial role, although clearly being a CMO is a very commercial oriented role as well, not perceived that way, and then somehow dive into kind of have a shot at being a CEO. Complete misconception, I think. And I wonder what's your take, guys, on that thought around can CMOs actually make the jump right into the CEO role, or the way it's currently structured, knee chance, try again, do something else first, and then maybe have a shot?
The whole aspect of path is what's traditional. And again, just keeping it UK focused, we see people moving from professional service firms, from finance, from operations, primarily into that role, less so from other functions, be it marketing, HR, etc. I mean, we can always look at companies like Burberry. We had obviously Christopher Bailey move from a chief creative officer role into the CEO role, succeeding Angela a good number of years ago. They're few and far between. Yeah. And I think, Richard, to your point, from my background and with talent that I've worked with, regardless of where they've come, I like oblique careers. I know in the past, McKinsey, Harvard Business Review have termed this such as tri-sector athletes, those who have worked across private sector, public sector, civil society, and have gained experience. I think the magic going forward is when you have more expertise, more general expertise across sectors and disciplines. So I like to see finance folk move into operations. I would love to see HR folk who understand people, who understand purpose, move into marketing. I like to, obviously, I'm biased here, again, having started my career at P&G, I love to see marketing folk better balancing something I call the romance or the art of marketing with the science of marketing. And that's not just talking about data and, not your return investments or being able to do net present values or the weighted average cost of capitals, but the real science, the metrics of marketing, but also really championing the romance and the narrative of marketing to build that growth story. So there is an aspect of balance, but specific to your question, we know what the traditional path is in the UK, but I do firmly believe in a more oblique path where more general experience is brought to fore and learnings across sectors are brought to fore. Because if we're trying to find the truly magical, the truly inspirational, the truly transformative, you're likely to look further than your immediate sector or your immediate discipline, which is why I'm a big believer in when I talk about diversity. It is that cognitive diversity. It is that fundamental difference of perspectives, outlooks, experience, thought, sectors, and social backgrounds coming together. And I think that's where the magic happens. And it's going to be more that case as we move forward in this sort of post-pandemic, even dare I say, post-Brexit UK that we're living through. So I think that's where we are on path, Richie.
Rory, do you have a point of view on that?
Yeah, I completely echo Darshan's point about cognitive diversity and people with oblique or T-shaped careers. I think that one of the interesting problems we probably have is that increasingly, and there are even, okay, at an extreme level, okay, there are people in business schools who argue that business schools should be closed down because you're producing a generation of people who've all been taught to think the same way, which is inimical to capitalism in some sense, because capitalism is ultimately, if nothing else, a competition of conflicting ideas. I mean, Five Guys have a different idea about what, a quick service restaurant is to McDonald's, and they fight it out in the marketplace.
Yes.
And actually, if businesses become more and more alike, you're destroying overall economic value, as well as, by the way, catering less well to a diverse population.
Yeah.
And I think the universal accepted boring narrative of business that it's a kind of efficiency and cost reduction competition is one probably promulgated by business schools to a dangerous extent. They have a fairly uniform view of, I don't think capitalism is remotely efficient, by the way. I think it's spectacularly wasteful. And I think its virtue lies in the fact that it's an evolutionary process of competing diverse ideas where nobody quite knows what they're doing, but ultimately the consumer decides the winner. Okay, I think that's how capitalism improves. And actually, the idea that's been sold, this idea of efficient competition and so forth, is, I think, deeply damaging to the value not only of business, but the extent to which businesses serve the population. And so having more diverse and divergent opinions, backed up, by the way, by the fact that this dangerous business tendency, now we do it without even thinking, okay? We think that the best proxy for the quality of a decision is the quality of the reasoning that led to the decision. Okay, that is a universal belief. Now, if you look at evolution or you look at the wider workings of capitalism, it doesn't work like that. The only way a decision is judged is by its consequences. Yeah. And you can have seemingly dumb decisions that work brilliantly well for reasons no one anticipated in advance. And you can have spectacularly intelligent decisions which don't work. And so I think what's interesting is we've come to see sort of quality of reasoning as a precondition for action. And I have to say, I'm not sure that's right. I think some degree of built-in randomness is essential, because if you look at businesses I really admire, okay, Nespresso, Five Guys, Red Bull. Okay, these are all billion-dollar businesses, all occupying categories where there were dominant leaders for many, many decades. None of them made sense in advance. Okay, in fact, I think Nespresso only survived because they lied about their sales figures for a couple of years in the early days. But none of, if you'd said, do you think there's a market for a disgusting tasting drink in a tiny can that costs £1.65? You couldn't find anything in market research, anything in economic logic which suggested this was a good idea. Dyson is completely bonkers, okay? And I admit this, if you come to me and said, I think there's a market for a £700 vacuum cleaner, I would have said, Jim, mate, let's look at the vacuum cleaner market as it currently stands.
Yes.
And we'll see Miele at the top, we'll see the Henry at the utilitarian bottom. And then I would have added the final stinger, which is anybody who can afford 700 quid for a vacuum cleaner probably doesn't do their own vacuuming.
But okay, so Rory, I want to cut in here for a second, because I think this is super interesting, because this is a perspective that I was about to swear, only marketers can bring to the party, right? This entrepreneurial sort of flair of what you talk about as randomness, right?
Yeah. I mean, Nassim Taleb makes the case that no one wants to admit this, okay, right? Because everybody wants to believe that they're virtuous, deserving people. But capitalism largely works because it rewards the lucky.
Yep.
Okay, so just as in science, the lucky accident leads to penicillin and goodness knows what else. Okay, in business, the lucky accident leads to somebody doing something unintentionally by mistake because they actually, in some cases, because they don't know what they're doing. Okay, I mean, the early Walmart family were very bad retailers in the conventional sense. Okay. And as a result, for some reason, the public discover that they like this thing, even though they didn't know it beforehand, and they buy it, and the organization flourishes. Now, in many cases, I think great business successes are entirely the product of serendipitous timing or luck, but capitalism wouldn't work if it only rewarded people with good reasons before times.
I'll tell you what, flipping awesome, right? And I don't know if you guys saw the Mr. Beast thing that came out yesterday. I don't know if you guys saw that. He's a YouTuber, within 18 hours had billions of views because he recreated Squid Game. Phenomenal. He spent $2 million on recreating Squid Game, and his prize money of $500,000 for the actual winner. No one died. Don't worry, guys. It's a PG show that we're putting on.
I was getting a bit alarmed.
But what's really interesting, I think, is the notion that you're describing, that actually it's about staying in the game to allow for randomness to happen and for creating that moment, enabling it to happen. And I think that's really important here. And I think the finance guys can never predict that.
The other point
this is where we focus on the need to be different, the need to be maverick. We're talking about, we've mentioned the terms, I think, unconventional and unintentional here. And if I go back, I'm an economist by background, and if I go back to the general theory of employment, interest and money, John Maynard Keynes, 1936, I know, Rory, you'll know this quote: worldly wisdom teaches us that it is better for reputation to fail conventionally than to succeed unconventionally. Not much has changed in about 90 years, let me add.
This is why I think the Austrian
to be a maverick. And I think, Rory, in the boardroom, we're there together next, and we go, it should be pink. It's unconventional. Rather than the 80% of discussion looking at the cost of this, the drivers of that, the hedging or derivative to protect us against the put option going up. That is where the magic and the maverick can come through.
But is that
worldly wisdom teaches us otherwise? But
is that on a come what may basis, Daushan? Because the problem is you're dealing with the other 10 individuals around that table, and as Rory articulated, he said if he said pink instead of price at that moment in time, he'd have been shunned. and I think this is the crux of this issue in that sense.
Mr. Crayon's talking again.
Exactly.
Well, there are two aspects there. There's a culture that you're in, and it's a numbers game. If you're the one person who is different in a group of 11, you're going to be challenged to have your voice heard.
I also think that's disproportionately a product. I think that's disproportionately a product of overwhelmingly male organizations, by the way. I mean, if you look at the worst offenders in this were probably historically organizations like the rail industry, which was spectacularly male dominated.
So, okay, I'm gonna bring another perspective here, guys. See what you make of this. So we talk about creativity, we talk about randomness, we talk about all of that stuff, and that's how exponential growth drives, etc. Mark Ritson did an article, right, where he looked at Burger King, right? What we are holding up as one of those creative random organizations. He compared it to Wendy's, and he looked at advertising and creativity, and then he actually shot down Burger King for effectiveness on the ability to say, actually, yes, super creative, and yet Wendy's steady, stable advertising actually created more effectiveness than Burger King as a whole. So how does that then play into our logic around this?
Well, of course, he's making a long-term argument versus short. I haven't seen the paper. I'd like to see the results, because he's actually, in fairness, he's quite complimentary towards some of what Burger King does, isn't he?
Yes.
There are some of their short-term promotions he's much more scathing about, but
can we say short-term communications as well?
Thank you.
Because it'll bring us back to the discussion. Again, not having read the paper, but the point, Richie, you make as well, long-term, well, firstly, how happy are the shareholders? I'll say firstly, that's unfair, but how happy are the customers? I used to love Wendy's when we had them here in the UK. Exhibiting my dietary preferences now, but how happy were the customers? Things we can't measure. So the argument he may put forward could hold at a certain point in time, that you've got happier Wendy's customers, I assume, versus my experience of Burger King's been, I shouldn't be saying it, should I? Has not been too good recently. But then the value return to shareholders, or the metrics that Mark is referencing, would be good to understand.
Yes. I totally buy into it, and I think the just that thought. I mean, the other great one that he recently referred to was the role of trust and brands. Right. A lovely article written about how Facebook was flying untrusted company, and actually, is there now a delineation between actually do consumers need to trust their brands, or is it actually far more basic than that, in order to have growth? And of course, us marketers love to talk about trust and love to talk about emotional connection with our brands and relationships with our brands. And is that doing us a disservice in the boardroom?
Well, I mean, it's worth noting that, of course, trust is a funny thing to measure, because it's very largely measured by what you don't have to do, oddly. Okay, so part of trust is it's all those sentences that your sales force don't have to utter before they can start selling. And so in many cases, trust is actually manifested in the absence of things, not the presence. In fact, this is also true in neuroscience, that if you see someone buying a trusted brand, there is inordinately less brain activity going on than when they're buying a new or unfamiliar brand. So one of the vital things, by the way, and I think we ought to, by the way, have a bit of a slag off at marketing here, because we're being slightly self-defensive. There are certain things I think marketers do have made mistakes with. I think the love affair with quantification, as though it was their salvation, turned into a bit of a straitjacket. Okay, to do great marketing, you have to do things which you can't necessarily define in advance. It's probabilistic, it's fat-tailed, all that kind of stuff. Okay, and the future is much more fat-tailed than the past. The past is only one version of many, many possible futures 2 years ago. Okay, that happened to play out. So that's one thing. The other thing I would make is that marketing probably spends far too much time trying to add positives rather than remove negatives. And it's the place I first look, which is, if you've got an interesting business, where are the friction points? Where are the bottlenecks in this process? And there's a lovely example from Orange. You may know this, which is fantastic. Okay, and now Orange won everything. Okay, in brand terms, you paid by the second. It was a fantastic. You were involved in fact, Darshan, weren't you? You were.
That's right.
Yeah. Now there was one problem. They didn't pay as much commission as Cellnet and Vodafone did to people like Carphone Warehouse. So the people in the stores didn't really want to sell an Orange phone. Okay. Now what happened was the salesmen were clever enough not to say, "Oh no, Orange, it's terrible," because that would be contradicting a customer. And so what they do is they play this game where apparently you go and say, I'd like a phone, please. And I'd like one of those orange phones. Fantastic brand job. And the salesman will go, yeah, brilliant idea. I've got one myself. Absolutely fantastic. Charged by the second. Where do you live? You go, Leighton Buzzard. Leighton Buzzard. Ooh, you don't want an orange phone in Leighton Buzzard. Now, signal's dreadful. You see? Now, if you lived in Hitchin, right? Oh yeah, orange phone would be fantastic. If you're in Leighton Buzzard, you really need Cellnet. Okay.
Amazing.
And they play out this bullshit, okay, right, 50 times a day. So quite often we need to look at sort of the theory of constraints, I think, in marketing, which is where's the friction, where's the bottleneck, what's the big obstacle? I've got a big one at the moment, okay? I think you could sell electric cars, I think very, very easily with two things, with a 4-day test drive and parallel running. Keep your gasoline car for a week while you try the electric car alongside, then decide.
Particularly because you'll run out of fuel anyway, because there's no fuel in the petrol stations to.
Well, that would have been a perfect moment. In which case, yeah, you could tease your petrol driving friends for their range anxiety. But you know, I think there are occasionally decisions where we look and say we've got to say this is really good, and you go no. You're looking at this. To be honest, you're knocking at an open door, except for this one stage in the process where you've got a massive obstacle. Maybe it's the last mile, maybe it's the first mile, but finding out where the bottleneck lies and operating there, regardless of what, because the other problem with ad agencies, and I'll criticize them like hell for this, is their muscle memory from when they were paid on commission still survives. And we disproportionately look for creative solutions which involve a bought media component. And I think in the modern economy, particularly with the kind of service brands we operate with now, I think, you know, for every problem, don't get me wrong, lots of problems, you know, lots of businesses would benefit from more bought media. I'm not disputing that. But the fact that we tend to, you know, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. We tend to define problem seeking with a presumptuous assumed solution has limited the solution space for creative marketing.
That's very, very, very true, Rory. Guys, we're running out of time. Just the one thing, and coming on to our last brief question. Interestingly, me and Darshan crossed over in our lives because we both work for Orange. My first job was actually at an Orange store. So I can relate, Rory. I can relate to your network problem. Although I promise you, I didn't do that.
I bet you did.
I think right, when you bring it back to marketeers, the magic is, I was there in the late 90s, and I spent a couple of weeks at a store on Borough High Street, it doesn't exist anymore, called In Touch Communications. And the magic marketeers can bring, yes, I was dealing with product, is understanding the customer, but not just providing insight. And this is the tough bit, it's inspiration as well. Because you don't know what you don't know. It's a cliche, I know that. And by providing those inspirational moments, you can take a business forward, which is why, you know, people still remember per second billing, the bundles that were put forward, the insights and inspirations I gained from the shop floor and then took into a boardroom and managed to push
most things nowadays. I think people don't want until they're available. It's adaptive preference formation. We don't want things we can't have. Okay. It's worth noting that in this group, I would bundle marketing with R&D and innovation straight away, because I argue that first of all, marketing and innovation are fundamentally the same thing. You create economic value either by working out what people want and finding a clever way to provide it, or working out what you can provide and finding a clever way to make people want it. Okay. And the money you make is the same either way, right? Okay. You know, the one extreme would be the pet rock. Okay. And on the other extreme, you might have salt in the late Middle Ages, you know, where people knew they wanted it. It was simply a matter of supplying it. In the case of the pet rock, nobody knew they wanted to carry a rock around. You simply created the emotional feeling that this was somehow beneficial in some peculiar way.
Build it and they will come.
But the vital thing is that I think innovation and marketing are two sides of the same coin. I think they should sit together very, very closely. And I think they should actually trade off and play off against each other. Even in things like pharmaceuticals, would you believe it? You know, I think there should be
product and R&D should cascade within that. So when we start to, you know, because we don't have any recognized standards, and you know, credit where credit's due as well. You know, people like you, Richie, are trying to raise the standards in marketing through, you know, your school of marketing and putting the standards out there. But we don't have a consistency across the various organizations and bodies. So what I view as marketing, what Rory views as marketing, may be different to what yourself and many other practitioners view. But I certainly take a more wholesome view where we do talk about growth. We own that agenda. We do talk about the end user.
Pricing.
We do talk about product.
There we go.
And of course, we do talk about communications as well.
One of the first ways
That's
to
not
innovate is
focus.
pricing.
I agree.
Guys, I'll give you a very simple fact from FMCG, which is quite often people significantly prefer 50% extra free to 33% off. Now, economists don't understand this because as far as they're concerned, it's the same thing.
Mhm.
Consumers perceive it differently. Jeremy Bullmore, I think, explains why when he says there's a difference between a bonus and a bribe. Okay. Now, the interesting thing is when you think about it, 50% extra free is much less margin eroding than 33% off the purchase price.
Yeah.
And so that's a really valuable discussion. And yet, if you believe in economics, you'll never make the distinction.
No.
Guys, we are unfortunately could talk all day, I'm sure, but we are running out of time. And I want to just end with one final question. By the way, just before we do that, anecdotally, I was having dinner just 2 days ago, and we finished up this dinner on a very positive note. And we said, "Hey, the future's bright," and then we both said, "The future's
orange."
Thank you.
Can you believe it? All those years later,
it still resonates.
all those years later. Right. In one line, one sentence each, if you've got a CMO who's looking to get up to CEO position, what was the one piece of advice you would give them in one sentence? Daushan, you first. Go.
Absolutely. Be brave, be different, be creative.
There we are.
Don't hide.
I'll give advice which is quite similar, actually. It's change your language, but don't sell out. So behavioral science can be quite useful because it gives
one sentence.
Oh, sorry. That was a colon, Daushan. Behavioral science is quite interesting because it describes consumer behavior in ways that sound recognizably scientific or economic. Behavioral economics. Okay, it's a very clever rebranding of psychology and marketing. But change your language. Don't always talk about the brand onion because they won't like it. Okay, change your language, but don't sell out. Don't become yet another balance sheet drone.
There we go. Gents, I have loved this conversation. High energy, high enthusiasm, great examples, and a lot of controversy. What a great session we've just had. I just want to thank you both for your time, your effort, and your energy. Honestly, it's been a pleasure. I hope everyone listening has enjoyed it too as much as we have. And I'm sure there's going to be a follow-up at some point in the future, so watch this space.